Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Moshe Safdie?
Speaking.
Moshe, this is Paul Holdengräber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. I'm so pleased that you're taking the time to speak to me. Thank you so much. Tell me, Moshe,
My pleasure.
Where do I find you now, and how have you been living this quarantine?
Well, for the first few months, I worked from home. And by state regulations, we shut down our office completely.
All of your offices?
And then, basically, for a while, it depended on the locality. So in Singapore, we shut when they shut down, and that was for a good several weeks. And here, we shut down until about 2 months ago. And then we started coming back slowly, like 20%, 30%. And that's the way we are now. Some are working from home, some are working here, and we're managing somehow.
Somehow, right? You wrote to me that you have learned much from experiencing the pandemic. And I'm wondering what you've learned, what is it that you've learned, and what is it that you've learned as an architect?
Well, in terms of an architect doing work of an architect, I've learned that there are many parts of the process which we can do remotely. When we're working on the detailing phase of the project and what we call the technical phase, we can Zoom with consultants, we can coordinate, we can Zoom between each other. But when it comes to the embryonic design phase, the conceptual phase, and we need, at least from my own process, we need physical models, we need the computers, we need the 3D printers, and then we discovered that we need face-to-face. It was impossible to begin a project that was in conceptual design without being face-to-face. You can't do it on Zoom. You can't do it on the screens. You need to physically be able to move things about, see each other, talk about it, respond within seconds to the give and take that goes on. So as an architect, in terms of what we design, I remember a phone call early in the lockdown period from a friend in New York, an eminent city planner who lives in a luxury building on the Upper East Side, and she said, "I can't open my windows. I've been here for many, many, many weeks. I don't have a balcony. I'm going crazy. There must be a law. There must be a law. You must be able to open the windows. There must be an outdoor space to any apartment, every apartment, no matter how little." And I thought that was, in a sense, for me, a reaffirmation of something I've been preaching for 50 years, but it's good to see it coming from grassroots, from just people's needs, that it confirms that this is not just architectural obsessions, outdoor space, ventilation, opening up, contact with nature, but it's really a fundamental need, and I hope people don't forget that.
Well, yes, and what you were saying also when you were talking about the necessity of a face-to-face encounter is that we need to have a conversation. We need to have a tactile feeling for others. We need to be close to them. We need to look at them in the eyes. And in a way, you've begun answering that question that you asked yourself about what you've learned from experiencing this pandemic. In a sense, Moshe, it really is, how do we want to live together? How do we want to be together? And how
as a community.
How can architecture at this moment in your long and extraordinary career as an architect, Moshe, I'm wondering, what this pandemic has made you think about in a very deep way.
Well, you keep hearing people, and not just people, but people in positions of influence, let's say employers, saying, oh, we really have learned from the pandemic that we can do much of the work at home. At least those who are not providing a service, not driving a bus or selling retail, but many of us can work at home. And that then you hear many of us prefer to work at home. I think that is an illusion, and it is off the mark. I think people have learned at many levels. People with young children who didn't go to school realize how difficult it is to work at home. And even when they are going to school, those have smaller apartments and dwellings and all kinds of disturbances. Also, people crave for contact and company.
Yeah.
So after a few weeks of people working at home, everybody was going crazy. So the notion that 50% of the workforce will henceforth be happy to work at home is an illusion and a delusion. I think if we learned anything, is that people crave for contact, that both crave for the urban realm, the meeting place of the city, the tradition of the agora and the square and the street and the contact in the public realm, and they crave that in their working life. And if anything we learned is that the idea of isolated work is not here to stay.
And for your friend on the Upper East Side, you might be thinking that air conditioning is not the solution.
Well, air conditioning might help you on a hot day, but if you're locked in, no matter what the weather is, in a hermetic seal, that's not the solution.
You were born, Moshe, in Haifa and witnessed the birth of a new nation. Do you have strong memories of Israel at its creation in 1948?
My memories have become more vivid because one of the things that COVID provided me is the time and the ability to concentrate on completing my memoir.
I've heard this, and I simply can't wait.
So one of the things I kind of relived in order to write it is my memories of that period, and they're amazingly vivid. I mean, I remember the weeks leading to the declaration of the state. Actually, my family made a trip. Much of my father's family was in Lebanon and Syria. And just before the United Nations November declaration of partition and the creation of the state, we traveled to Lebanon and Syria, and I visited my grandmother in Aleppo. And I remember my uncles ripping off the school badge off our shirts because they had Hebrew on them. Hebrew letters, the school logo. And then we rushed back, and that was the last trip I ever made to Lebanon. But I remember the excitement. I remember, of course, the fighting in Haifa because there was a major battle in the city. Some of the Arab citizens leaving, escaping, running away. I remember the actual event of being downtown when the loudspeakers were carrying Ben-Gurion's speech. So all this is quite vivid in my mind.
And you're writing about that at this moment. So you're
I've just sent the draft to the publisher. So it's well underway.
But I imagine it's a project you began before the pandemic.
Well, the fact is I had pieces of it. I started and stopped and never had the ability to kind of keep going in a concentrated way. And being at home for several months, while also, of course, doing the work that was required by my practice, I did discipline myself to just sit down and do it.
And develop some Sitzfleisch, as it were.
Yeah, it's a draining process, I have to say. You end up dreaming about it at night because you've been kind of writing about it during the day. And in my case, I started looking up old files to see letters, correspondence, press clippings, and all of that brings various events back to life, and you tend to kind of relive them. And some of it is super exciting, and some of it is reliving tough days that you've experienced in the past.
You've said that Yad Vashem is probably the most profound and perhaps the most important piece of architecture I've ever done. I'm wondering how so, and I'm also wondering in the context of our world today. And I remember that extraordinary part of Yad Vashem to the children with that single candle, and
Children Memorial.
Yeah, and it's going back really to the elemental. But I'm wondering. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm wondering what you meant.
Well, I think that I would say that in terms of the work of an architect, there are those projects, those problems, those projects, which affect our daily life in a profound way. And in no way can one take down the significance of that housing, the workspace, how we live, the public realm. These are the kind of, let's call it the warp of life, if I was to make a metaphor to a tapestry. And our role as architects is central there, and I don't want to in any way play it down. But also as architects, we are called to rise to a much more profound and demanding symbolic level. And that occurs when we design a place of worship, a memorial, a significant museum devoted to a significant subject. And that is when architects go from routine music to profound music, if I'm to make a composer's analogy.
Yes.
And Yad Vashem falls into that category. As an architect, I've often wondered with some envy, could architecture ever rise to the emotional engagement and level of music? As a music lover, I always wondered about that. And Yad Vashem is one of those projects where you are tested. And I guess I feel that I've achieved what I aim to do, where the architecture and the narrative of the museum and its profound place in the memory and history of not just the Jewish people, but the world, has been given an appropriate place to be and experience. So it is, in that sense, the most demanding and difficult thing emotionally that I've worked on.
And you've spoken in so many different contexts about the importance of never verbalizing what you meant symbolically. I heard that laugh, and I'm
that is true, because so many of my colleagues think that they need to spell out exactly what you ought to be thinking and how you ought to be associating their symbolic intentions. And I always contend, if you need to explain it, then it's not working. Moreover, our association with symbolism and symbolic associations is totally subjective and personal. So one person would derive and associate an architecture experience in a particular way, and another one in a completely different way. So even if you had intentions in your own mind, I think you're best keeping them to yourself.
It's very close to what David Lynch says all the time, that he really does not want to explain his movies in any form or fashion. How dangerous that is, because then the word of the creator really becomes the word of the person who's experiencing it, which I suppose is really what you don't want at all. Now, Moshe, Louis Kahn would sometimes say to himself, how am I doing, Corbu? How am I doing? And in a way, search for an answer from him. And I'm wondering, does Moshe Safdie sometimes say to himself, Kahn, how am I doing?
It's an interesting question, because it of course brings the full complexity of my relationship with Kahn. And I suppose if you asked me the question differently and you said Khan would ask Le Corbusier, who would you ask? Maybe my first gut reaction would be I would ask Darwin.
Okay.
Yeah, I wouldn't ask Le Corbusier. I wouldn't ask Frank Lloyd Wright. I would ask Darwin. And in a sense, I say that because I think there's an aspect to architecture which is evolutionary, which is about fitness to its purpose in every profound way. And while Darwin is not an architect and he won't answer the question, at least he sets the criteria. I could say I would ask Darcy Thompson, who, evolved the science of morphology about the causality of form and in nature. And, well, he might be a very good judge about the causality of form in architecture. But if I'm to be less profound and sort of talk about respect and influences and a voice that I would heed, I would be very interested in how I'm doing with Khan. I would think that there are some things that I do that probably would not appeal to him because our persona and sensibilities have evolved differently. I would think that he would think some of my work to be too sensual or maybe too, how shall I say it? So, it's a complex question. I'd be very interested in what Frank Lloyd Wright thinks of what I do, even more so than Khan, by the way.
I'm interested in this, of course, for the connection you have with Khan, because you worked with him, as it were, when you were in your early 20s.
Right, and I have the utmost respect for him. And as I say in my memoirs, he taught me what it means to be an architect in the sense of what it entails. What are the inputs? You begin with an embryonic idea and you nurse it and you craft it and you give it materiality and you test it and you mock it up and you test it in a model and finally you build it. And you stick with it through the whole process. And that I am forever indebted to him. And I know how rare that is in architecture and how few architects really give the process the complete attention through every phase. Of course, he's not the only one. There are my contemporaries like Renzo Piano, for example, who I'm sure works in a similar way. But also I learned a lot from him in terms of conceptual, in terms of his philosophy. I think it's still very central to my thinking. But the interpretations, I think of a design like Marina Bay Sands in Singapore, or even the Jewel Complex in Changi Airport that I recently completed. I just can't see Lou going there. He was too austere.
And do you think you will go there after this pandemic? The mega scale, because I know that Khan worked with a very small office of 25 or 30 people. Do you?
Most of his buildings were relatively small scale.
Right.
Even when he did towers, there were very small scale towers. Khan, partly because of history in terms of the period, and partly in terms of inclination. Mies is a contemporary of Khan, and he dealt with a big scale. Le Corbusier dealt with a mega scale, you can say successfully or less successfully. So it's not just generational. Khan was interested in the scale that could be comfortably dealt with. He didn't make that leap to accepting that scale has changed completely in terms of the high-rise city. He did do some projects like the plan for Philadelphia with the office space-framed like office structure and the towers and the parking cylinders. So he was an urbanist, don't get me wrong, very much an urbanist. But I don't think he anticipated the scale of and density of Hong Kong and Shanghai and all the mega cities that are sprouting everywhere in the world.
Do you have a hope, given the very first question I asked you, based on something you said to me that you learned so much from experiencing the pandemic? Do you have a hope, and maybe is it part of what you hope for yourself, that architecture might become in some way more socially conscious in the wake of this pandemic?
I think my concerns are that one of the things we learned in the pandemic is how messed up our body politic is.
No kidding.
How the gap of income, opportunity, environment between the 1 or 2 or 3% or 10% and the rest of society is so extreme. And so the first question in my mind is not architectural, but is social and political and economic. We have managed between 1950 or 55 and 2020 to polarize society in so many ways to such extremes. And that has to be resolved, not by architects. That has to be resolved by our political system, by the debate on policy. And my concern is, will people remember and take the lessons of how exposed so much of the world was and how unfair the impact seemed to have been as we go forward, or will we go, business as usual, forget it all once we have a vaccine?
Yeah, will we go back for what my mother always said, passes for normal?
Yeah, and continue the current situation. And, when you listen to some of the rhetoric in the current election, it's not very encouraging.
Yeah. I want to take...
I'm an optimist, though, I'm an optimist. I mean, somehow it'll... I mean, I cannot believe that the world experiences this traumatic experience and the kind of economic consequences and doesn't go forward and do something about it. As I hope there'll be some awakened awareness about our environmental crisis, which the climate crisis and the environmental crisis. So sometimes it takes this level of shock to bring sense, and let's hope that happens.
But architecture, in a way, though, you said you're more concerned by the political aspect. Architecture, in a way, also plays a part there. I mean, from your friend who lives on the Upper East Side, that's one story, to people who have no place, no space for conviviality. So I'm, taking you back, as you most probably have come in great depths, to one of your very first projects, your Habitat 67, which you described as the most radical building I ever built. And I'm wondering, in some way, radical. How so radical in the context of today? Is there a seed in that project for our time now, Moshe?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, what fascinates me about Habitat, I said radical because it was a game changer.
Yeah.
And it was, at the first phase of its existence, 50 years ago, it was a game changer conceptually.
50 years.
People all of a sudden, it is more than 50 something. So the game changer was first that people could look at it and say, oh, there's other ways we could do apartment buildings. There's other ways we could do towers. There's more humane and exciting ways in which we could create urban density while maintaining certain quality of life. But that was just conceptual. For the first decades, nobody actually seriously thought it was applicable on a wide scale. I think what's changed now is that it's becoming so there it is, 50 years old, and it's as fresh and radical today as it was 50 years ago, which means it's maybe time has come now, because now there is much more active attempts to explore the concepts of habitat by the next generation of architects. And that's actually very exciting for me to see the next generation of thriving and creative young people, relatively young to be, taking these concepts and taking them further. So that is one of the and I can see that being accelerated now, because the desire for dwellings which open to the air and to nature and so on is really on the rise. People are becoming aware. Even take the sense of the question of the public realm.
Right.
For decades now, we've been building malls totally sealed, introvert, turned away from the city, multi-level, many of them lacking daylight. And people flocked to them and thought that's fine. Well, I think the age of that kind of mall is over, because people say, well, we want light, we want air, we want to experience what people had experienced in the past, and when they had streets and parks and boulevards and they were out there in nature while they were in the marketplace at the same time. They didn't have to get into these sealed capsules. And I think these are big changes that are going to occur now. Unless we go back to what you were fearing before, right, which is kind of consumption. I think unless we have to get over this induced consumption. It's like, actually, I think our consumption there must be like, how we force ducks to consume so that we can get the foie gras.
I do know.
And sometimes I think that there's some mysterious force in capitalism that forces us to consume, and we get our livers, metaphorically, swell, and we get unwell because of this forced feeding of consumption. Because you wrote to me also so interestingly that growth is not the only route to prosperity. And I'm wondering, in your own practice with this pandemic at this moment, are you thinking of a more intimate architecture, less on a mega scale, as if you will? I think we always will seek the intimate architecture where we have the opportunity, but I don't think we can not in our lifetime, reverse the condition of megacities. There are just too, we're not going to reverse population very fast, the desire to live in cities because that's where employment is and many other things. So I don't think that big picture will change in our lifetime or the next generation's lifetime. Therefore, we have to solve it. The fact that people would love within that to create some sense of intimacy and privacy is what my work is all about. But I don't think I can reverse it in terms of the basic condition. I can just say, well, if you're going to build a housing complex and it's going to have a density of, let's say, a floor coverage of 12 or 15, to use a technical term, then I'm going to do my best to break it up, to give it a better scale, to bring in outdoor space, etc. But to go back to what I wrote you, I meant growth not in a physical sense. I meant that growth, our economy is all about gross consumption, and also about the personal consumption. And to achieve prosperity, we induce consumption. Right. And so that our stock market, our whole sense of prosperity is consume more. But consuming more uses resources which are scarce. Consuming more does not always improve the quality of life. It is a culture of consumption and obsolescence. And in that profound way, well beyond architecture, I think we need to start thinking in terms of achieving prosperity without induced growth, just the growth needed for raising the quality of life, raising the standard of living. That kind of growth works, but the consumption-induced growth, I think, is destructive. Moshe, what a pleasure it's been speaking with you, and I really can't wait to read your memoir, and I imagine that for a younger generation of architects, but not only, there'll be lessons to be learned, and it might be, Moshe whispering in our ears as Kahn could have done, or Le Corbusier, or so many others. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you, and I thank you very, very much. Thank you. Enjoyed it, and all the very best. Take good care. Bye-bye. You too. Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.